You know how it works. It takes a minute. Hello, everyone. I'm welcoming our guest, Simone Rizkallah, who is a Catholic expert in the media, and she is hosting a new conference that is called Shoulder to Shoulder. It's in Kansas City, but it's also online tomorrow. I'd love everybody to watch it, and I'm sure if you're watching this discussion, it will be online after the fact as well. And the subject is the friendship between Jewish and Catholic communities, and it rises out of this unsettling that has been happening in the political spectrum and in theological circles around the rise of anti-Semitism in Christian circles, not just Catholicism. And I speak as an evangelical. I see it in our family as well, in our tribe, our part of the family. So, Simone, welcome. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. And I apologize to your listeners that I'm suffering from spring allergies. So,
Many of them are as well. So tell me a little bit about this conference that you're having in Kansas City.
well, I'm very, very excited to host this conference at Benedictine College, which is considered one of the Newman colleges. So, there are many, many Catholic colleges in the United States, but there's only a minority of colleges that have the privilege of being considered one of the Newman colleges, which is that theological orthodoxy, piety, devotion is quite stringent at the school, and so I have a great respect for Benedictine College. As a former high school teacher, I would definitely encourage my students to apply to Benedictine College. So the fact that they are hosting, co-sponsoring with the coalition, Nostra Aetate conference for their students is a great honor and privilege.
So there was a history long ago, in modern history anyway, it seems a long time ago, of pockets of anti-Semitism within Catholicism, and that had largely been addressed in the past. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think if there's a Catholic or Catholic adjacent or Catholic curious person listening to this and wondering what does the history of Catholic anti-Semitism look like, there's a wonderful book by Father Edward Flannery called The Anguish of the Jews. And that is a great primer on what historically has been our, difficult history, challenging history, bad history. And sometimes the argument comes up that, well, the church was never anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism has to do with racial bigotry. Okay, true. But there was certainly an anti-Judaic, what is called the theology of contempt to Jews in Judaism that certainly existed in the church and for centuries. But then I would say, thanks to the Holy Spirit, the church decided to, and especially in a post World War II, post Holocaust world, the church decided to address our relationship with those of non Christian religions, particularly our relationship with our Jewish fathers in the faith or elder brothers, and really kind of set the record straight, because after something as horrific as the Holocaust and the atrocities of the Holocaust, there certainly needed to be a pastoral and spiritual response to the problem of the buildup from centuries of anti-Judaic thought in the church.
In the evangelical tribe of the Christian family, we have generally, broadly speaking, have a tradition of saying that God made a covenant with Abraham, which became the country, the state of Israel, the country, the race of the Jews, and that we, after the crucifixion of Christ, were brought into that as part of that covenant. So we see ourselves as tied to that, and we, broadly speaking, recognize that covenant with the Jewish people is still intact.
Yes.
That doesn't change the fact that there seems to be this rise even within evangelical, or you might say maybe not evangelical, but the Protestant sector of Christianity, that there is factions now within Protestantism, which has a rise of anti-Semitism. So I can't speak to Catholicism, but tell me about this movement within, particularly, what is it, Gen X, or where are you seeing these falsehoods resurrect in a sense, because these are old ideas and concepts
Right.
that are renewed again.
Right. So anti-Semitism or anti-Judaic hostility is, often called a shape-shifting virus. And I guess what the crisis in the church right now, it's certainly not Gen X, I would say. I mean, there are definitely figures in fringe Catholic circles that are older, I would say classic anti-Semites that exist.
I don't recognize, by the
What's
way, I
that?
do not recognize Gen X as old.
Yeah, that's right. No, I'm talking about old, way older than Gen X.
It's older
But
than,
I
yeah.
would say most of us. I'm an older millennial, sadly. But those fringe figures were not taken seriously by the dominant, larger American Catholic population. So much so that in 2023, when the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism was being launched, and the work for it actually began in 2022 to respond to what the data was showing was rising rates of Catholic anti-Semitism. I would say most ordinary American Catholics would, on the spectrum of American Catholics, would have been completely shocked that this is a problem that we have to address. Didn't the church address this in the Second Vatican Council? It's never been part of our official teaching, obviously. You mentioned that evangelicals, understand St. Paul in Romans 9 through 11, that this covenant is irrevocable with the Jewish people. Catholic teaching teaches that as well. So as a Catholic, we don't have the liberty, as maybe many evangelicals do, to kind of go in and out of churches that may or may not agree with them. If you claim to be a Catholic, you must be loyal to the teachings of the magisterium, and in which case that is a teaching of the church, that the covenant with the Jewish people is irrevocable and it's mysterious, and that we're supposed to grapple with that. Sadly, the emphasis has been on that theology of contempt, and the emphasis has been about Jewish rejection of Jesus and disagreement about who the Messiah is. But there are just as many scripture verses from St. Paul about God has not rejected his people, that they're beloved and chosen, and to them belong the sonship and the glory and the covenant. So it's time for the next 2,000 years to maybe be an emphasis, a theology of kinship, so to speak, as opposed to a theology of contempt. So it was a huge shock to us in 2023 before what happened on 10/7. And then after 10/7, I think now there's no longer a shock. I think most ordinary Catholics who are somewhat plugged in are aware that there's a problem and are particularly worried about it moving out of the fringes, which there's always going to be fringe movements that we don't like and disagree with, and that are unchristian and unbiblical and untraditional, un-Catholic in the name of the church, in the name of Christ, which is very scandalous. But now, as it's hitting our Gen Zers, our young people, that has become a great source of anxiety and concern for older millennials like me, Gen Xers, boomers, who could never have imagined that the landscape of the American Catholic Church would be anything but a post Nostra Aetate, post St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, Francis, Pope Leo, who are all very clear and adamant about the evils of anti-Semitism. So that possibility that what was otherwise a very pro-Jewish, pro-Israel American Catholic landscape can shift because of Generation Z into one that doesn't take for granted Nostra Aetate and the teachings of the church and Pope John Paul II and so forth is difficult to adjust to, if that makes sense.
How much of this can be attributed to the pollution of the Christian faith, Catholic or Protestant, by modern politics, by the fact that people don't like what's happened with the Prime Minister of Israel, or they have a political disagreement with him, or they
Right.
don't like the response to October 7th and the events attacked Israel. How much of this is a pollution of Christian theology by modern politics and the time and the culture in which we live?
Yes, I think you nailed it. I think it is always man's temptation to want to stray away from our spiritual callings, the the necessity and the moral obligation to build a healthy culture, Christian culture, a culture of Judeo-Christian values, and to be distracted by politics and political power. So I think that's definitely part of it. Stepping back in my work in the Catholic apostolate for the last 20 years, because my work in Jewish Catholic relations has only been in the past 3 years. And again, we largely took for granted a pro-Jewish, pro-Israel stance. And the statistics still show that, thank God, but we have to be concerned. And the statistics are also showing the increasing problem. And again, like, I think of my Egyptian parents who grew up in Cairo, Egypt, who had Jewish friends, who struggled, who suffered, who eventually had to move to Israel. These are part of my family stories and stories from my Middle Eastern background. I realize that that isn't always the context of an American Catholic. That what's happening in the Middle East, whether it's about the Jewish problem or the Christian persecution problem, or is not really an American everyday Catholic or Protestant issue, Although I have to say, I've always been so grateful to my evangelical brothers and sisters because as a young person, as a first generation immigrant from the Middle East, it was always the evangelicals that really put a spotlight on Christian persecution, apart from the Eastern Catholic churches, but it was largely ignored in my Roman Catholic circles, and it was evangelicals who really paid attention to that, and I always was so, so, so grateful to that. But anyway, all this is a long way of saying that in my work in the Catholic apostolate for 20 years, I always felt this disconnect of exposure to the actual cultural, spiritual, political problems of the Middle East and America, this gap in understanding, and also within the church, a lack of authentic spirituality. That sounds very critical, but what I mean to say by that is so much of America, and America is very politicized, period. We're a very individualistic, very politicized culture, and that has penetrated the churches, whether Catholic or evangelical or Protestant. And so I used to lament that. I want to have conversations with the church about the mystical body of Christ, about what does it mean to be in relationship with people, and so much of that would get politicized. And so now I'm seeing it as transfer into this issue of Jewish Christian relations. So, churches how many Catholic churches would pray for Ukraine? And Ukraine deserves prayers. But Ukraine was also in the news. But Armenia wasn't in the news. So then we didn't really pray for Armenia. So when politics, again, it's understandable, it's predictable, but when politics dominates the direction of the church instead of the church being the direction of spirituality and building culture, it's problematic, and it certainly has become problematic in this case. Yeah. I like the fact that Gen Z is disturbed by things going on in the Near East. I do wish that there could be more formation of untangling what's a spiritual problem, what's a theological problem, what's a cultural problem, and what's a political problem.
That's right. The filter greatly matters. I don't think it's simply the church in the West that's tainted by the politics. When I talk to Christians in China, they're living in a bubble of communism, and it really is everywhere. But we notice it here because we can hear on X, on other platforms, people free flowing the thoughts and the impulses that they're getting from their sources and from their politics. And as a believer, if you're watching, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, whatever it might be. We want to be people of the book, first and foremost, to be in it, in this world, but not of it. So you have decided to have this conference, and tell me now. Let's break down how you're going to address this problem, because I want people to watch this, to go in and tune in, whether it's live or after the fact, to this. You're going to address this really in a positive way. You're talking about shoulder to shoulder friendship between Jews and Catholics. How are you breaking down this subject matter?
Yes, I have to firstly say that I love Gen Z. Gen Z are the ages of my former high school students. I love them. I know what they're capable of. They definitely have a desire for tradition, which I love, authenticity, which I love, and they do want to make a radical gift of self. I think so much of the problem of losing numbers in the church and whatnot is because we haven't made a bold Christian claim. We haven't been demanding enough of the lives of young people, and John Paul II often said, if not always, most often said, man truly finds himself in a sincere gift of self. These kids, I guess they're in their 20s, but they want to make, the older ones, want to make a sincere gift of self. They want to know what's true, and they want to be convinced, and they deserve that. So this conference in particular is the first conference the coalition has organized, which is specific. Well, we did launch the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism at another Newman College, the Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ohio. But since that, that was planned before 10/7, this and all this craziness, this one is the first conference we've planned. I think it's the fourth conference that is specifically with Gen Z in mind, noticing the conversations that they're having on social media, largely, on X, on Instagram, on all the other crazy social media platforms out there that I don't even know the names of anymore, and trying to see what it is they're talking about, what it is they're grappling, and make an attempt to answer them on their terms. So that was the inspiration and impetus for this conference in particular.
So some of the sessions read here, Christ's Jewish identity and biblical roots of Christian kingship. How would you describe that subject matter?
Yes. So is that the first session or the second
Yes.
session? Okay. So there is sadly this weaponizing of a very beautiful and legitimate phrase, Christ is king. And sadly, that has now become an anti-Semitic dog whistle in many cases. Now, you can't judge the intention of everybody posting that on, if it's the Feast of Christ the King, I'll post Happy Feast of Christ the King. But it has sadly been weaponized. And as a way to say, hey, Jews, you're wrong, submit to Jesus, Christ is king, kind of like a bully tactic.
Almost like a threat.
Like a threat. Yeah, like I'm going to throw out this libel, this conspiracy theory, this slander, this statistic, this story, and then end it with Christ is king, as if that kind of disposition has ever been a great witness to the love of Christ. Anyways, so what I find painful as an educator is that phrase, Christ is king, has a history behind it. And the history behind it is and if you really want to read about it, there's a great book on the dignity of society by Dr. Russell Hittinger, where he discusses this. The idea behind it is that Christ is king. In other words, reorient our hearts and minds to spirituality, to the depth of God's love and mercy, and that there's no political power that is ever greater than the spiritual power of Jesus Christ the King. So then to take the spirituality behind that phrase, which is what it was historically intended for, and then to use it for politics is, I think, the inverse, perfectly inversely demonic of how it was intended. The other thing that's interesting is that God is king is a theme of the Jewish feast of Rosh Hashanah. That is the feast of Christ the King in the Catholic liturgical calendar, is the last feast day before the new liturgical year. Rosh Hashanah is the new year in the Jewish calendar. So we have paralleled so many, as you know, of our Christian and Catholic feasts after Jewish liturgical dates. To be able to bring that kind of education to people who are either weaponizing it or exposed to people who are weaponizing it, I think is very important historically and theologically to note.
And then another session was Judaism as it understands itself. What would we learn from that?
So I'll make a side point. I understand, and I understand that for Jews, the idea of Jewish converts to Christianity is apostasy, is deeply painful. And they can see something like that, like a crash course in Judaism taught by a Jewish guy who became a Christian, as something offensive. I understand that perspective. On the other hand, the Christian claim is that Jesus is the Messiah. So again, to expose, my audience is not Jews, my audience is Catholics, right? For them to see that, as Pope Pius IX said, or 11th said, spiritually, we are Semites. It is unchristian to be anti-Semitic. To understand our Jewish roots, it's not only a way to fight anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as you know, David, is a symptom of a larger spiritual and cultural problem. It's a way to say, this is the gospel as we claim it and intend it. So to cut off from our Jewish roots is to live some other life, but not the full Christian life that is proposed in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah.
That's right. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. The theology of Christianity is that we grow out of the legal case that Christ made on the cross as forgiveness of sins, and it was tied to his lineage in the Jewish tradition, and we can't separate from that. That's part of the story. So understanding all of the politics, all that sort of thing, we have to struggle through this, and I'm proud of you for hosting these kinds of events. Another session here, Pope Benedict's theology of Israel. So you'll talk a little bit about statements coming out of Catholicism about this covenant that as the Catholic tribe sees it.
Yes, I love Pope Benedict so much, and many Orthodox, faithful, traditional Catholics also love Pope Benedict. So my dream, if I could dream aloud, David, is that Catholics would, if we could just get past this really weird moment, God willing, right? Because it should be very obvious that anti-Semitism is wrong. Harboring anti-Judaic sentiments, adjacent, whatever you want to call it, God knows the heart, is also wrong and reductionistic and missing the gospel. And to get into St. Paul's encouragement to like grapple with the mystery of Israel and the church, the magisterium's call to grapple with that. So, there's so many, Catholics who have been 5 minutes claim to be the social media's catechists and teachers about you can't be a Catholic and a Zionist. That's not true. Number one, you can't be a Catholic and a Protestant Zionist, but we knew that. Catholics know they're not Protestants. Catholics know they're evangelicals. They know that if they're Zionists, that they're Catholic Zionists. Why are we creating a false, dichotomy here? And sometimes, and I hate to say this, but, and I don't know if we've talked about this offline, but sometimes the question is this really anti-Judaic stuff, or is this you want to fight Protestants and they love Jews, and so you Catholics can't like Jews so much? I mean, whatever it is. So Pope Benedict wrote tremendously on this document called Grace and Calling Without Remorse. And in it, I think he makes a plea that there needs to be more theological work done on Israel. When you think about the Council of Nicaea and how we got our creed, and that was in the 4th century. The church had been around for 4 centuries before we got the Nicene Creed. Well, I don't know how many centuries it's going to take, but I wonder 100 years from now, 200 years from now, what's going to be the Catholic Church's Zionism or theology of Israel that's going to be so much richer than, hey, don't be anti-Semitic. Hey, we're part of this, they're part of, we're related to them as John Paul II said, our relationship with Jews is in a certain sense not something that's extrinsic, but intrinsic to us. We have a relationship with Jews that we have with no other religion or people. What's Catholic theology on Israel going to look like in 100 years? And I'm very excited to have a talk by a professor who teaches at Benedictine, who is an expert on Pope Benedict's talk, to kind of move us in that prophetic, theological, exploratory direction that is totally obedient to the church's teachings and at the same time trying to get us to move to the next season of our friendship, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I'm going to ask your opinion. It might be slightly controversial on the spiritual state of the Catholic Church at large and its leadership. But let me just say this as a qualifying before I ask you the question. I can recognize as a Protestant and as evangelical within that there are some so-called Christian leaders who have their theology has very little recognition to me with the teachings of Christ. They've sort of spun out into a realm of their own that is not moored in the grace and the teachings of Christ, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I can also look back as an outsider and say, over the course of history, the Catholic faith may have been led by people who weren't, I'm being gracious here, as spiritual as some of the ones that I admire within the Catholic history. I loved John Paul II and so forth. What do you think is the spiritual condition of the leadership and of the Catholic Church right now, which really comes into play as to the strength of the Church to respond to anti-Semitism as well as the other cultural issues going on?
Yeah. Well, are you speaking of, say, the Vatican, or are you speaking of, say, like American Catholic leaders and all of that?
I am
All of it?
controversially asking you to step in and say, where do you think you're at? You can address it through Pope Leo. You can address it through the leadership. Or
Yeah.
I think it cascades down to a large degree. But tell me what you think.
I think we're in a very fragile moment, very fragile, because the leadership of the church, I'll speak for the American Catholic Church, the bishops, for example, Archbishop Sample did a video. He's a traditional Latin Mass advocate, right? Very traditional archbishop, right? Made a video condemning anti-Semitism. That's really important. I'm really glad the USCCB did that. They didn't just pick any bishop. They picked a very Orthodox traditional bishop. No offense to their bishops. I'm very, very happy about that. I'm very grateful to Bishop Dolan, to Bishop Barron. Listen, the fact is, no matter how Orthodox these bishops are, and they are excellent, as soon as you say anything about anti-Semitism or the Jewish people by certain people, you're going to just be dismissed. I think I'm less concerned because, and you probably know this, David, from church history. Renewal in the church has always started grassroots, right? At least I'll speak for the Catholics, right? St. Francis was just St. Francis. He was just Francis, a guy that wanted to live radical poverty, and eventually, lo and behold, the Franciscans, and now the Franciscans got baptized by the clergy, right? Same with St. Dominic, and then they became the Dominicans, and now the ecclesial movements of the church, the charismatic renewal in the church, right? It was just this revival of the Holy Spirit, and then, oh my gosh, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, the popes agree to it and say, oh my God, this is an authentic fruit of the Holy Spirit, and now we're going to have our clerical approval. This next phase of renewal and spirituality must come from lay people. It is how revival always happens in the church. I don't want to say this isn't important what the Pope says or what the bishops say. It is. It's more important what they allow lay people to do. So while we have this time where the Newman colleges, these Catholic colleges, where the leadership in the United States, where the Catholic media outlets are all totally switched on to this problem, they understand it, they're concerned about it, and they're in positions of influence and power. This is the time to continue to do conferences like the one we're hosting at Benedictine tomorrow, because we have to have a way to disseminate history, a robust intellectual life, and a robust theology of the church that is going to help Gen Zers and others sift through the quasi-intellectual thuggery, if here, I'll make it controversial, the quasi-intellectual thuggery of what's going on online and what's going on with certain Catholic apostolate leaders out there. And, I'm happy to name the names of these, but maybe I shouldn't. They should be able to sift through. Oh my gosh, this is someone who's claiming Catholic authority that really doesn't have it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, you gave me my controversial clip for the.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Okay, so where can people find this? I'm going to provide the link on all of these social media posts, but tell us where people can find this conference. I want everybody, Catholic, Protestant, wherever you're at, to listen in on this discussion.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it. Yes, and if you can't watch it live, you can always just sign up and get the recordings later, but I hope many of you tune in. So if you'd like to join the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism, you can go to catholicsagainstantisemitism.org. If you'd like to sign up for the Benedictine Conference, please go to our social media handles, and the link is in our bios there that connects to the Benedictine College website page to sign up for the conference.
Wonderful. Okay, and I will provide all those links. Thank you, Simone Rizkallah, for this discussion. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, David.